They came in the dead of night. For all the fortifications, for all the fires lit and the swords raised, the living had never truly believed the dead would win. An undercurrent of defiance, or perhaps desperation, ran through each man, woman, and child who took up arms or sheltered in crypts. But deep inside their marrow, they feared what was coming. Winterfell was a bastion of ancient pride, cloaked in northern resilience. The castle had never fallen to the dead before. The denizens of the north believed in old magic and old gods, and they clung to them in their hour of greatest need. Yet, the others knew no gods and recognized no mortal pledges. The Night King commanded his whites and White Walkers with a silent authority that refused to yield before steel or spirit. And so, everything changed when the night's unholy frost lanced through the halls of Winterfell, ushering in the triumph of the dead. Sansa Stark had looked over the battlements earlier that evening, her breath misting in the frigid air, and she saw that the storm rolling in was more than just clouds. It was an omen. Jon Snow, determined and hopeful to the last, had rallied the northern troops and Daenerys Targaryen's armies to hold their lines. Somewhere in the sea of darkness below, Ghost prowled among the living, as loyal as any direwolf could be. Daenerys and her dragons soared overhead, their roars echoing in the ice-laden sky. Bran Stark waited in the Godswood, trusting that destiny would unravel as it was meant to. Arya Stark patrolled the walls, light on her feet, a dancer of shadows. Ser Brienne of Tarth tightened her grip on her sword hilt, every ounce of knightly devotion burning in her gaze. Each individual's faith smoldered, born of 1,000 hopes that refused to be snuffed out by any frigid wind. For a fleeting moment, it had seemed possible that the living might endure the night. But the others had a power older than the ages, and the magic unleashed was as unrelenting as death itself. The first sign of defeat was not the crumbling of any wall but the failing of hearts. Within the initial clash, when unsullied spears thrust forward and Dothraki rocks gleamed in fiery arcs, there emerged a point where the defenders realized that the numbers of the whites were beyond counting. Their dead eyes glowed pale, and they poured forward like a flood over broken farmland. The stench of rotting flesh and a deep supernatural chill announced them. No matter how many were cut down, more came. Then the night erupted in chaotic screams. Winterfell's defenses fell back, step by trembling step, men and women alike forced to concede ground. Dragons blasted gouts of flame across the battlefield, forging walls of fire that gave momentary relief. But the brunt of the army of the dead pressed on, unstoppable in their singular purpose. The Night King gazed upon this carnage from his demonic perch, an icy hush exuding from him. He lifted one blue hand and, like a ghastly ripple, dead bodies rose again to fight, each ally lost becoming another soldier for the White Walkers. When the last lines faltered and the unstoppable tide of white smashed through the gate, the story of Winterfell's living reached a precipice. Panicked defenders retreated inside the yard, the air reeked of blood and fear. Corpses littered the snow, many of them newly minted whites, eyes gleaming with undead wrath. The dragons fought fiercely above, but a single blow from an ice-tipped spear brought Rhaegal spiraling down into the gloom, where he vanished beneath swarming figures. There came the roar of Viserion, half-rotten and reanimated, clashing with Drogon in a frenzy of draconic fury. On the ground, the living scattered like mice before the hawk's shadow. It was at that moment that Sandor Clegane, known to many as the Hound, realized that survival would demand more than mere skill. He gripped his sword with shaking fingers, cursing the gods, cursing the fire, and cursing the monstrous illusions that haunted him. He had battled all manner of horrors throughout his life, knights turned rabid dogs, kings drunk on power, undead shades that defied logic, but this was fear beyond all rational measure. In every corner, a white's hand stretched forward, severed heads gnashed teeth, and roars of dying men and women built the crescendo of doom. With trembling curses, Sandor forced himself to keep going, brandishing his blade to chop down whatever abomination tried to end him. Always he found himself guarding, if inadvertently, the smaller folk around him. And so he didn't notice her at first, Lyanna Mormont, her face bloodied, her breath ragged, clinging to life after being tossed aside by a giant white. Before Sandor could get to her, he heard her final war cry as she plunged a dragoglass dagger into the beast's frosty eye. They toppled together, giant and girl. The world was a swirl of snow, shrieks, and heartbreak. Sandor roared in defiance, but the ground was already slick with blood and ice, and the dead pressed ever onward. Jon Snow, in those final minutes, tried desperately to push toward Bran in the Godwood. He knew the key was there, the end to the Night King's terror. Yet whites materialized from every angle, forming walls of frozen limbs and burning eyes that pinned him in place. Jon fought with every ounce of skill hammered into him by his mentors Qhorin Half-Hand, Jeor Mormont, and Ser Alliser Thorne. Each slash parted bone from sinew, but each step forward was undone by the next wave of undead. He could not break through. Daenerys swooped in with Drogon, setting the ground ablaze in an inferno of flame and charred skeletons. Her silver hair whipped across her face as she urged Jon to climb onto Drogon's flank. They soared above the battlefield together, resolved in their final gambit to strike the Night King from above. As they descended with blistering flame to destroy the Heart of Darkness, the Night King raised his spear of ice. It glinted in the moonlight as he hurled it skyward. The spear took Drogon in the side, sliding between scales with unholy precision. Though not immediately fatal, it was enough to send the dragon reeling, a spine-chilling roar escaping Drogon's maw. Daenerys clung to the ridges of her mount, crying out Jon's name in terror as Drogon crashed onto a parapet. The impact hurled Jon from the dragon's back. Daenerys managed to hold on, but her steed was severely wounded, half-pinned beneath tumbling stone. As she tried in vain to free Drogon, a wave of whites scrambled onto the ruins, creeping toward them like an unstoppable disease. Jon, head-wringing and unable to see clearly through bloodied vision, forced his battered body to stand. He raised long claw, prepared to fight his way to her. And then the Night King descended from the sky on Viserion's rotting back, that dreadful creature exhaling blue fire that turned living flesh to crackling ice in mere heartbeats. What followed was the last great stand inside Winterfell, with the living surrounded on all sides. Grey Worm and the surviving Unsullied fought like an impenetrable phalanx, their discipline never wavering, though their faces reflected the hopelessness surging around them. The haggard remnants of the northern armies rallied around Jon, forming a defensive ring. Brienne, still unwilling to bend the knee to the creeping doom, stood by Jaime Lannister's side, both of them bloodied from countless fights. Tormund Giantsbane howled, voice raw with a savage fury unique to the free folk. Samwell Tarly, tears freezing on his cheeks, clutched a dragonglass dagger, half lost in a nightmare he could hardly believe was real. And Sansa, from somewhere behind the lines, kept the frail embers of hope alive in her heart at least for one more moment. Then everything went quiet, as though an unnatural hush had fallen upon the living. The Night King strode through the battered gates, his footsteps silent. Behind him came whites in a horde so thick that the courtyard brimmed with death. His generals, White Walkers with crowns of frost, flanked him, their pale blue eyes glowing with a dark, ancient hatred. In the sky, Viserion wheeled, bellowing his ghostly wail, a herald of doom overhead. The Night King regarded Jon Snow, who stood trembling but resolute, defiance alight in his eyes. An unspoken command passed from the Night King to his minions, and they parted, granting him space. Jon shouted, voice torn by grief, rage, and desperation, and charged with long claw raised high. Daenerys had tried once more to command Drogon to burn the Night King. The dragon summoned the last reserves of fire from his belly, releasing a gout of flame that painted the yard in orange brilliance. When the flames disappeared, the Night King stood unscathed, an ice spear forming in his hand. Unholy frost tightened across Drogon's burned body, forcing the dragon into a keening wail. Then Jon brought Longclaw around in a massive arc aimed for the Night King's pale neck, hoping for a miracle in the steel's ancient Valyrian forging. Their weapons met. The clash reverberated across the courtyard, sending shards of ice splintering around them. In that blinding moment, Jon felt a surge of power course through him, a final echo of Lolor's fire, perhaps, or the lingering magic of his resurrection. For a heartbeat, the Night King's dead eyes flashed with something akin to surprise. But the White Walker's strength was fueled by centuries of dark enchantment. Where Jon's arms trembled under the strain, the Night King moved with perfect, glacial calm. An icy blade found its mark, slipping beneath Jon's defenses, slicing him open at the side. Longclaw clattered to the ground, wrung out one final metallic note, and Jon collapsed. The army of the living cried out as one. Daenerys shrieked, tears and fury warring across her face. She tried to reach Jon, tried to run, but whites closed in around her, tearing at her dress, scraping with frozen claws. Drogon roared, half-dying, trying to protect her. And the rest of Winterfell's defenders saw in that moment the all-encompassing might of the enemy arrayed against them. A hush claimed the courtyard as the Night King raised his hands, calling upon that dreadful power that resurrected the newly fallen. Bodies began to stir, Unsullied whose throats were torn out, Northmen with caved-in skulls, even the lifeless bulks of the Dothraki sprawled in the bloodied snow. Jon's eyes fluttered open, ringed in frost, his face ashen, his breath stilled. He had stood against the darkness with every shred of his mortal soul, and now the darkness claimed him as a thrall. It was thus that the White Walkers won the Battle of Winterfell. In the days that followed, the living scattered. Some hid within the ruins of Winterfell's collapsed towers, some fled into the countryside, seeking shelter in half-buried huts or abandoned holdfasts. All around them, the snows drifted in thick blankets, and the White Walkers marched on with their new additions to the ranks of the dead. Winterfell fell silent except for the scraping of white footsteps and the hollow wind rattling through broken walls. The once proud castle, seat of House Stark, stood as a mausoleum. Doors hung askew, the courtyard was littered with the reanimated husks of soldiers, and the banners of the dire wolf lay trampled into frozen mud. The protagonist of this tale was neither a great lord nor a famed knight. She was a girl of the north named Adolin Holt, the third child of a minor house sworn to the Starks. She had been given the humblest of tasks: feed the ravens, carry messages, help with rations. When the horns first sounded that night, Adolin's father and 2 elder brothers had taken up arms, telling her to stay inside where it was safe. But there was no safety in Winterfell that night. Terrified and alone, she had fled when the walls were breached, seeing glimpses of her kinsman's final moments as she darted through hidden corridors. When she finally emerged onto the open field behind the castle, the icy wind cut her face like knives. Everywhere she looked, shambling figures lurched across the drifts, searching for survivors. That night, she stole away, crossing the farmland where the battle had begun, stepping over corpses half buried in the snow. For days, she wandered, sustained only by a sack of grain she had stolen from one of the outbuildings. She witnessed horrors beyond imagining: entire villages turned into dens of wights, farmsteads with fences lined by the heads of the dead. Food became scarce. Clean water froze in wells. At night, she huddled beneath pine trees, shivering so violently her teeth never stopped chattering. She dreamed of her family, their laughter, and wondered if it was worse to hope they had died swiftly or fear they were now conscripted into the Night King's legion. But something in Adolin refused to succumb. Maybe it was the same stalwart spark that burned in all true Northerners. House Holt's words were not grand or poetic, they simply said, "Rooted in winter." Her mother had always said those words reflected the North's endurance, to remain steadfast when all else withers. In a world conquered by the dead, that motto became her guide. Eventually, she found herself trailing along a back road, an old route once used by merchants. The land was an icy desolation, the sky a low gray that pressed down without mercy. She kept walking, one foot in front of the other, remembering old stories she'd once heard from a traveling bard about how the darkest nights gave way to dawn. There was little sign of dawn in this realm, though. The winds seemed to carry the echo of wailing ghosts. On her 8th night of wandering, she found an abandoned tower perched near a frozen stream. It was half collapsed, but in its lower chamber she found enough rubble to barricade a small corner. She had barely closed her eyes when the nightmares returned, visions of White Walkers emerging from swirling snow, nightmarish silhouettes set against the gloom. Just before dawn, though day and night had blurred beyond recognition, she heard footsteps crunching outside the tower. Her heart raced, she pressed herself against the cold stone, wishing she could vanish. Slowly, she peered through a crack in the collapsed masonry. At first, she saw only a swirl of white. Then a shape materialized, a man leaning heavily on a spear, limping through the drifts. He wore patched furs. His hair was matted and his cheeks were sunken. It was impossible to tell if he might be friend or foe. But he looked human. And though fear hammered at her mind, she felt a tug of pity. She forced herself to stand and edged around the debris. Gathering her courage, she let out a soft call, "Who goes there?" The man spun, brandishing the spear. His eyes were wide, pupils darting as if expecting an ambush. When he saw her, just a frightened girl, his posture slackened. "Name's Tom," he croaked, voice raspy from thirst. "I'm only looking for a place to hide." Adolin studied him. Thin, starving, exhausted. Though she felt terror curling in her stomach, she also felt a glimmer of recognition. They were both just trying to survive. She beckoned him inside and they shared the meager shelter. In hushed tones, they spoke of what they had seen. Tom was from a farmstead farther south, had watched with horror as the dead overwhelmed his neighbors and fled before the whites could catch him. He had no illusions. "Winter is here," he muttered, leaning against the tower wall. "And we've nowhere to go." She offered him a handful of the last bit of grain from her sack, which he devoured gratefully. She asked if he had heard of any living armies regrouping. He shook his head. The rumors say the Night King marches south, leaving every keep in ruin. My guess is he's heading to King's Landing now. And the rest of us, well, we're left to freeze. For a long time, they sat in the dark, their shared breath forming ghostly plumes in the cold air. Adeline's mind churned. There had to be some way to fight back, some place where survivors gathered. She refused to believe everyone was gone. We can't just wait here to die, she said, voice trembling but determined. We need to find something. Someone. There's got to be others, people who escaped. Tom only gave a weak shrug, the hopelessness plain in his eyes. But Adeline would not let despair claim her. That night, as the wind howled beyond the tower's crumbling walls, she mustered what remained in her. Despite fear and heartbreak, she recalled the stories of the first men who faced the long night thousands of years ago. They had found a way then, forging alliances with the children of the forest. She could not allow herself to think that all was lost. Over the next weeks, they traveled together more for the sake of hope than certainty. Some days, they encountered only ravens circling overhead, their black wings a silent lament for the state of the world below. Other days, they discovered footprints in the snow or the faint trace of a campfire, suggesting that not everyone had succumbed. They saw small pockets of whites too, wandering aimlessly as if searching for prey. The only safe strategy was to hide. One near-disastrous encounter forced them into a collapsed stable, cowering behind splintered wood as the dead shuffled by. Adeline's heart pounded so loudly she was sure they would be discovered. But they remained unseen and the whites passed on. Their journey came to a pivot when they ran into a group of survivors led by Mira Reed. Adeline knew of House Reed, loyal bannermen of the Starks who had once guided Bran beyond the wall. Mira was gaunt, her muscles stringy from hard living, but her eyes held fierce resolve. She led a handful of men and women, some crannogmen, others from Winterfell's retinue, who had escaped through the broken walls when the battle was lost. They had been roaming the swamps and hidden paths of the Neck, though winter's wrath had turned much of the wetlands into frigid bogs. Meeting Adeline and Tom was a tenuous moment, each side raising weapons until Mira recognized the crest on Adeline's tattered cloak. The small holly leaf embroidered on the corner. Trust came slowly, but despair forged new alliances. Around a sputtering fire one evening, they shared stories of their tragedies. They learned that Mira had tried to find Bran after the battle, only to discover that the boy had vanished, his ultimate fate unknown. As for Sansa, Arya, and the others, no word. Yet rumors abounded. Some said Sansa had been dragged away by whites. Others whispered she might have escaped through the crypts. The fate of Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons was equally murky, with stories weaving in the darkness. Some claimed Drogon flew away with the queen's corpse draped over his back. Others insisted she was taken by the dead. The uncertainty gnawed at all of them, but they pressed on. For staying put meant freezing to death or worse. Mira's group led them east, into lands once dominated by House Serwyn. The plan was to cut across the White Knife, though ice and snow made travel perilous. One morning, they encountered a small group of whites wearing tattered Stark armor, the remains of men who had once stood valiantly for Winterfell. With numb dread, Adeline spotted a face she recognized. The stable master who used to laugh and feed the horses apples. He lunged at them with dead eyes, compelled by the Night King's will. They dispatched the whites with dragonglass-tipped spears and torches. Adeline felt tears burning in her eyes. Mira placed a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. No words could heal the wound of seeing your loved ones turned against you in such a grotesque fashion. Their small band continued on. Food was scarce, game even scarcer. The group survived on roasted roots and the aka. Sinal squirrel or rabbit caught in snares. More snow fell, heavier each day, as if the entire world was burying itself in an endless white tomb. Time lost meaning. Night and day merged under the gray gloom of the sky. But through it all, Adeline continued forward, spurred by the memory of what Winterfell once stood for, a beacon of unity in the north. Gradually, news trickled in from other escapees they came across. They heard King's Landing had tried to fortify against the undead, that Cersei Lannister had refused to believe the threat until it was too late. Now the capital burned with eerie blue fire, and the living who had not fled were either slaughtered or added to the Night King's army. The White Walkers' unstoppable march claimed every stronghold in their path: Moat Cailin, the Twins, Riverrun, Harrenhal. Old families were wiped out, their banners lying soaked in blood and ice. The realm was well on its way to total extinction. Yet a whisper of something else circulated, that perhaps in the far far south, beyond the deserts of Dorne or across the sea, some harbored secrets to fight the White Walkers anew. Maybe the Red Priests in Volantis or the Warlocks of Karth held hidden knowledge. But traveling that far seemed impossible given the state of Westeros. Rivers had frozen, roads were impassable, and every step outside was fraught with whites lurking like patient predators. 3 months slipped by as Adeline and the others struggled to survive one breath at a time. Their numbers dwindled. Disease and starvation claimed some, white attacks took others. Tom was lost in a blizzard, separated from the group, never to be found. Adeline wept for him that night, remembering how he had devoured that handful of grain in the tower so many moons ago. The next morning she woke more determined than ever to see the next sunrise. Her tears turned to ice on her cheeks, but she refused to bend. Mira, resourceful as any Crannogwoman, guided them through seldom-used waterways, hacking through ice with axes to find fish or eels. They broke into old storerooms belonging to minor lords, gleaning what meager supplies they could. Whenever they spotted a column of whites, they vanished into the underbrush. More and more, Adeline felt the press of inevitable doom. She recalled, in fleeting glimpses, the warm interior of Winterfell's great hall. The memory ached with longing. She remembered the flicker of candles in the windows, the smell of hot bread, the distant sound of laughter. Now all that lingered was the hush of snowfall and the moaning of the bitter wind. One rare morning with clearer skies, Mira led them to a crumbling watchtower once used by House Glover. It stood on a small hill, offering a vantage point of the surrounding farmland, now a frozen tundra. In the distance, they glimpsed a shambling mass of figures, hundreds of them moving like shadows across the horizon. The pale light of the sun, weak as it was, glistened off their ice-encrusted armor. At the center of that legion rode pale horsemen, White Walkers. Adeline's blood ran colder than the wind. The army of the dead was still on the move, unstoppable, searching for the last remnants of life. They hid in the watchtower's rubble for hours, scarcely daring to breathe. The undead horde passed by, never deviating. Adeline could almost sense the suffocating aura emanating from that mass. She closed her eyes and prayed, for the first time in her life, to the old gods, to the Seven, to anything that might hear her plea. She prayed for the living to somehow endure. In the aftermath of that near-sighting, Mira confided a plan. "We'll try to reach the Vale," she said quietly, scanning faces for any spark of hope. "The area is nearly impenetrable. If anyone is left with the means to fight, it might be there." No one needed reminding that the Vale's roads were dangerous, especially in winter. But the possibility of a secure fortress hidden high in the mountains offered a lifeline of hope. It was decided. So began another perilous trek. They crossed cold rivers, forging paths around undead-infested towns. They glimpsed scattered survivors here or there, but many avoided them, too afraid or mistrustful to join forces. Winter was not only cruel in coldness but in how it starved compassion. Soon, the small group that had once counted a dozen was whittled down to 6. One night, Adeline and Mira scouted ahead while the others rested in a ruined barn. The moon was partially visible, lending a pale luminescence to the snowy fields. They followed a narrow track through a patch of woods, careful to step lightly, for the crunch of ice could echo. Suddenly, they heard the unmistakable sound of whites rustling among the trees. Without hesitation, Mira motioned for Adeline to hide behind a thick trunk. Holding their breath, they peeked around to see a handful of the dead shuffling aimlessly, heads lolling as if searching for a scent. Adeline felt her pulse thundering in her ears, but Mira silently gestured for them to wait. After a few agonizing minutes, the whites drifted onward, continuing their ceaseless patrol. That was the essence of life in Westeros now, an endless game of cat and mouse between the living and the legion of the dead. Adeline knew they could not do this forever. Even if they reached the Vale, would it truly stand? Or would they find only death beyond its gates, the errand knights reanimated and patrolling the high passes? Finally, they saw the mountains of the moon in the distance, their jagged peaks cloaked in white. The air was thinner, the climb steeper. Avalanches and slippery paths threatened to end them as surely as any white's claw. As they ascended, the wind whipped across ridges with a ferocious howl. Adeline's limbs ached from cold and exhaustion, each step a monumental effort. But she pressed forward, following Mira's lead. They had lost so much already, each step was a testament that they still breathed. When they came within sight of the Ares' towering perch, Adeline felt tears pricking her eyes. Even in winter's bleakness, the castle appeared formidable, perched high above the valley. But something was wrong. The portcullis lay broken. Flags of House Arryn, shredded by wind, drooped lifelessly. The gatehouse was dark. Nothing moved along the walls. Fear twisted her gut. Carefully, they made their way to the main entrance unchallenged. The courtyard inside was coated in a thick layer of undisturbed snow. Ice crystals clung to every ledge and parapet. They explored in tense silence, hearts pounding. In the great hall, they found echoes of a hurried defense, broken weapons, toppled chairs, signs of a final stand. Blood spattered the once pristine floors. And here, as they ventured deeper, they came upon a small group of survivors, ragged and starving, huddled near a cold hearth. At their forefront was Lord Yon Royce, his once stalwart figure now hunched with fatigue. He looked at them with hollow eyes, hardly believing new living souls had come. "Our lords are gone," Royce croaked in explanation. "Darkness came. We tried to fight. Those beasts scaled the mountains on the backs of ice, monstrous spiders, they say. We lost so many. Then, as if by some mercy or trick, the whites withdrew. But we're trapped here, no supplies, no hope." He gestured to the half-dozen men and women behind him, each as pale as the snow. "We're all that remain." Mira swallowed a sob. Even in the mightiest fortress in the Vale, the story was the same: despair and a slow death by starvation or cold if the dead did not return to finish the job. Adeline knelt beside an old knight, offering him a bit of their last rations. She looked around at the silent gloom of the Eyrie. She realized that illusions of a hidden safe haven were just that, illusions. The Night King's victory in Winterfell had sown the seeds of the realm's collapse. The question was not if the living would lose, but how soon it would happen unless a miracle intervened. Despite the gloom, Adeline felt a rebellious spark ignite in her core. If no fortress was unbreached, if no bastion could hold out indefinitely, then the only recourse was to face the darkness, to seek some means to break it. More than once, she had heard mention of dragoglass or Valyrian steel or the fabled horn of Joramun said to awaken giants. Legends swirled through her mind, desperate, dim possibilities. She confided in Mira, who listened with weary eyes but didn't dismiss her outright. Perhaps there's something in the crypts beneath the Eyrie," Adeline offered, recalling half-forgotten rumors of the Vale's storied past. But Royce shook his head. "I've searched. Nothing but bones and dust." Mira pursed her lips and thought. What about the old knowledge? Didn't Samwell Tarly mention once that the Citadel had volumes on the Long Night? Royce sighed. Old Town has likely fallen by now. Even if it hasn't, that's leagues away in the far south. We'd never survive the journey. Though it seemed impossible, Adeline refused to bow to despair. She proposed a bold plan: to send out the fastest among them, searching for any sign of an organized force of survivors. If the Night King's army was continuing south, then somewhere, someone must be formulating a last stand or a final strategy. They had to try or rot in this mountainside castle until the cold claimed them. After days of debate, desperation won out. Mira volunteered to lead a reconnaissance. Adeline insisted on going, though Mira tried to dissuade her. "You've done enough," Mira argued. "You're young, you should wait here, where it might be safer." But Adeline set her jaw and declared, "I'm not safe anywhere. None of us are." And so they set forth once again. They took with them a small retinue, 3 men and 1 woman from Royce's meager band, all equally driven by the refusal to remain idle. Adeline and Mira led the way. Lord Royce remained behind with the elderly and those too weak to travel, clinging to the slim chance that help might still come. Descending the mountain was more treacherous than the ascent. Avalanches lurked, and the air was so thin it burned their lungs. Once they were back on the plains, they navigated a labyrinth of half-buried roads and iced-over streams. The cold became more punishing with each passing day. Their rations dwindled to crumbs. Yet on they went, fueled by the faint hope that somewhere a spark of the living's defiance burned. When they reached the riverlands, a stark horror greeted them. The rivers were clogged with ice and corpses. Ravens perched in leafless trees, hungrily picking at remains that no one had risen to reanimate. The White Walkers no longer needed small pockets of dead when their primary legion marched forward in unstoppable strength. The group trudged through deserted villages, so silent that even the crows seemed unsettled. Occasionally, they found tracks belonging to whites, and if they followed them far enough, they'd find entire barns or taverns turned into slaughterhouses. In the shattered remains of an inn near the Trident, they discovered signs of a recent skirmish, fresh dragoglass shards and bits of battered armor. Adeline's heart quickened. Someone had fought here. Could it be a group led by some recognized figure? She found a broken sigil on the floor depicting a golden rose. She held it up in the faint light. House Tyrell was no more, their seat had fallen long before. Perhaps these were renegade Reach men, or maybe it was a salvaged bit of armor. No matter the origin, the presence of dragonglass proved there were survivors with knowledge still out there. Pushing deeper south, the snow began to lessen in places, though the cold remained. The weather patterns were unnatural as the White Walkers seemed to bring perpetual winter with them. Their small group avoided main roads. Once they spotted a large contingent of whites, hundreds strong, sweeping across a field under the direction of a tall white walker astride a pale horse. The living crouched behind an old stone fence, hearts hammering, until the legion passed. Adeline observed that even though the dead were unstoppable, they marched with a sort of methodical inevitability as if they had no reason to rush. The living were cornered prey in a realm that was swiftly succumbing. And yet, after more harrowing days of travel, they encountered the first real sign of hope, the faint glow of fires at night from within the walls of Harrenhal. Once a monstrous ruin, Harrenhal now flickered with the energy of human occupation. Approaching stealthily by night, Adeline and Mira spied from a ridge. Guards patrolled the outer battlements, living guards, judging by the warm torches they carried. The fortress loomed with its legendary melted towers, courtesy of Aegon's dragons centuries ago. It was rumored to be cursed. But if living souls had found a way to fortify it against the dead, then that was reason enough to risk discovery. They debated how to approach without being shot as trespassers. Mira decided the direct route might be best, holding a white cloth as a sign of peace. Warily, they ventured down to the massive gates. What greeted them was a tense standoff, scores of archers, spears aimed through murder holes. A harsh voice demanded to know their names and purpose. Mira stepped forward to explain, her voice echoing off the blackened stone. At first, suspicion reigned in the guards' eyes. Too many times had whites or white walkers laid cunning traps. The group was ordered to remain still while a figure emerged onto the ramparts. Adeline nearly wept with relief and shock upon recognizing him. It was Ser Davos Seaworth. He looked far older than she remembered if her memory could be trusted, but the man was unmistakable with his grizzled beard and kind, sorrowful eyes. He peered down at them, a mixture of disbelief and hope crossing his features. "Open the gates," he commanded. Inside Harrenhal, they found a motley assembly of survivors from different houses, Lannister soldiers who had fled King's Landing, Stormland knights who had lost their lords, Reach farmers desperate for shelter, and a scattering of Northmen. Ser Davos, along with Brienne of Tarth, who miraculously stood among the living, had led them here, forging a last refuge against the cold. Brienne looked hollow-cheeked, the once sunlit gold of her hair dulled by grime and sorrow, but she managed the faintest of smiles upon seeing Mira. They embraced, clinging to each other as tears of relief streamed down their faces. Exhausted beyond words, Adeline nearly collapsed. She felt arms steady her. A man with mismatched eyes, carrying a dented sword, offered her water. He introduced himself as Gendry, speaking softly about how they had rallied what living they could after the fall of Winterfell and King's Landing. Adeline's mind whirled with conflicting emotions, heartbreak, exhaustion, gratitude, fear. Here, at last, was a pocket of resistance. But was it enough? Once she caught her breath, she asked the question that had lived in her heart all these months: is there a way to defeat them? The White Walkers. Davos exhaled a weary sigh. We've tried. We gather dragonglass, we forge weapons. But we have no dragons left, no high garden harvest, no airy storehouse. We survive on what little we can scavenge. Half the people here suffer from frostbite, the other half from nightmares. Still, we hold on. Brienne spoke next, voice tremulous with a subdued fervor. I watched Jaime. She paused, swallowing. He fell fighting the whites while trying to protect me. They took his body before I could stop them. But I swore I'd keep fighting, if only to honor those we lost. Her eyes flitted across the ragged courtyard where men and women huddled around fires. I won't let the dead have the final victory. In the days that followed, Adeline and Mira discovered the precarious nature of Harrenhal's defense. The fortress was enormous and there were not enough people to adequately man every wall. Yet its thick, blackened stone offered a semblance of security. The wide moat, though partially frozen, still posed a hazard to whites. Morale was fragile, balanced between the terror of the unstoppable undead and the flickering unity found in shared adversity. Adeline did not remain idle. Rooted in winter, her family's words reminded her that in the darkest times one must find strength. She helped fortify barricades, carried fresh arrows to archers, and learned how to shape dragonglass arrowheads under Gendry's instruction. She joined scouting parties, sneaking beyond the fortress to find any sign of the enemy's advance. They knew the dead were still out there, a silent avalanche waiting to crash upon them. Mira and Brienne often spoke about old stories of heroism, Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, legends that once centered on Jon Snow or Daenerys Targaryen. But those heroes had fallen. They wondered if a new hero could rise from the ashes of ruin. Adeline listened, simultaneously hopeful and afraid. Did she truly believe in prophecy? Or was the only prophecy that the dead claimed all eventually? As more weeks bled into months, Harrenhal's meager stores dwindled. The defenders took to dangerous foraging missions, often losing lives in the process. There were nights when whites probed the outskirts, testing the defenses. Arrows rained down, torches flared, and the living prevailed, but just barely. Each skirmish chipped away at their numbers. They had no illusions of indefinite survival. If a full-scale assault arrived, Harrenhal would likely fall. Yet, in this time of desperation, alliances formed between people who once would have been mortal enemies. A handful of ex-Kingsguard from Cersei's reign stood shoulder to shoulder with Tormund Giantsbane, who arrived one bitter evening leading a ragged group of free folk survivors. Tormund's once boisterous laugh was now subdued. He had traveled from the remains of the Gift, searching for any safe haven, and lost most of his people along the way. He bore the heartbreak of a world undone, and in one quiet moment by a campfire, he told Adeline about the wonders of the true north, the way the wind felt on a bright day, the crispness of the water, the majesty of a mammoth herd. All of it was gone now, swallowed by an endless winter. She saw tears glisten in his eyes, though he tried to hide them. But what set events in motion for a final, desperate clash was the arrival of a certain hooded figure at the gates. The guards recognized her petite form and swirling grace as she slipped inside. Arya Stark. She looked like a half-feral ghost of her former self, covered in grime, eyes hollowed by sorrow. She carried a Valyrian steel dagger at her side. Upon seeing her, Brienne nearly collapsed in relief. Arya only embraced her for a moment, stiff with suppressed emotion. In the council chamber, a makeshift strategy room lit by a single guttering lantern, Arya revealed what she had learned in her lonely wanderings. She had spent months tracking the White Walkers' movements, venturing near King's Landing, where she glimpsed the Night King. She recounted the devastation. The Red Keep shattered. The city turned into a necropolis of swirling ash and snow. But amidst the horror, she overheard rumors of a single dragonglass arrow shot from the scorpions that once targeted dragons. An arrow rumored to have wounded the Night King himself. While it did not kill him, it suggested that if they could amass enough force, if they could craft a strike with the right weapon at the right time, perhaps they might finish what was started in Winterfell. "We need cunning," Arya said, voice low, eyes burning with fierce determination. "We can't meet them in open battle. We need to strike at the Night King directly. One blow. That's all it could take if we do it right." Davos rubbed his grizzled chin. "And how do we do that?" A glimmer of the old trickster spirit flashed in Arya's eyes. "We lure him into a trap. He'll sense us eventually. He'll come for us, believing we're pinned at Harrenhal. But we have to make the kill certain. No second chances." They set to work on a plan so risky that it felt like madness. Brienne, Mira, Gendry, Tormund, and Adeline all contributed ideas. They identified a portion of Harrenhal's ruins, a collapsed tower near the western courtyard, where they might hide an arsenal of dragonglass and wildfire. If they forced the Night King to enter that courtyard, perhaps cornered by illusions of a smaller force, they could detonate the wildfire and simultaneously strike with Valyrian steel. It was a desperate gambit, but no less than the situation demanded. Days of frantic preparation followed. They rummaged through the fortress, finding old caches of wildfire from the days when Aerys Targaryen's pyromancers had hidden stores across the realm. Dented catapults were repaired, and dragonglass shards were hammered into ballista bolts. The living at Harrenhal worked together with unwavering resolve, aware that if their plan failed, they would be consumed by the dead. Adeline found herself forging arrowheads side by side with a Lannister soldier who once might have spat at a Northerner. But the apocalypse made old hatreds meaningless. At last, word reached them of the White Walkers' approach. A small scouting band encountered the vanguard of the undead near the crossroads, their silhouettes darkening the horizon. The final confrontation was upon them. Fear seized the hearts of Harrenhal's defenders, but there was no running now. They had laid the trap. All they could do was hope the trap would spring. As the day of reckoning dawned, a day no lighter than any other in this endless winter, the watchers on the walls spotted the legion of the dead. Thousands upon thousands of whites covered the plain, led by tall white walkers astride pallid horses. At the center, upon an undead monstrosity that might have once been a warhorse, loomed the Night King himself. His eyes radiated that cold, alien light, devoid of mercy. The defenders of Harrenhal shuddered, but they steeled themselves. What followed was the last stand of the living in the heart of the Riverlands. A partial force manned the outer gates and ramparts, acting as bait, sending arrows raining down upon the undead. The whites surged forward, a wave of decaying bodies. Adeline was stationed high on a tower, scanning for the Night King's movement. She gripped a dragon-glass-tipped arrow in her trembling hand, though she was no marksman like an archer from the Vale. At her side, Gendry monitored one of the ballistas loaded with a dragon-glass bolt. Screams tore the air as whites flooded the moat, shambling across the ice, some cracking through into dark water, but enough pushing forward to form a living, undying bridge of limbs. Staggering at the gate, the defenders fought with savage desperation. Many were overrun. The whites hammered at the gates with supernatural strength until they began to crack. Then came a thunderous crash as the outer defenses gave way. The army of the dead spilled into the main courtyard. Davos rallied a line of spearmen, their weapons tipped with dragonglass, trying to channel the dead toward the western courtyard trap. Tormund bellowed, hacking at whites with his mighty axe. Arya danced among them, a silent whirlwind of deadly grace, her Valyrian dagger flashing in quick jabs. Brienne stood side by side with Mira, every strike purposeful, every breath defiant. Slowly, yard by yard, they retreated, drawing the undead in deeper. Then Adeline saw him, the Night King, gliding forward with regal malice, flanked by White Walker lieutenants. The courtyard beneath the western tower was rigged with wildfire caches hidden among rubble. All that remained was to lure him into range. Arya darted across the yard in plain sight, her face set in grim determination, hoping to taunt the Night King. He locked eyes on her, perhaps remembering the near-death blow she had once tried to deal him at Winterfell. With an almost imperceptible signal, the Night King urged his steed forward. The final act began. A chorus of horns sounded from the walls and the defenders scattered, leaving the open space seemingly undefended except for Arya. The White Walkers advanced. The moment the Night King crossed the threshold into the tower's shadow, Gendry and Adeline triggered the mechanism from above. A hail of flaming arrows ignited the hidden wildfire. The courtyard exploded in a blast of emerald flame so bright it seared the eyes. The roar shook Harrenhal's foundations. Unholy shrieks filled the air as whites were consumed by green fire. The White Walkers reeled under the sudden conflagration forced back. But the Night King remained, emerging through the flames, ice radiating from him in a swirling vortex, extinguishing the wildfire in patches around him. Within seconds, the dancing emerald tongues receded where he stepped. Across the yard, Arya recovered from the shockwave, battered by debris but still clutching her dagger. She launched herself at the Night King with a feral cry, dagger aimed for his back. His reflexes were unnaturally swift. He whirled and caught her arm mid-strike, the dagger's tip inches from his neck. A heartbeat of silence. Then Tormund hurled his axe from behind a broken archway. It soared through the air, spinning end over end, striking the Night King in the shoulder. A glancing blow, but enough to make him release Arya for an instant. She twisted free, landed lithely on her feet, dagger still in hand. High above, Adeline seized her chance. She notched the dragonglass arrow, took a shaky breath, and loosed. The arrow streaked downward. The Night King, in a gesture of cold inevitability, raised his hand. A swirl of icy wind deflected the arrow, shattering it mid-flight. Adeline's heart plummeted. Had all of this been in vain? The Night King advanced again, unstoppable. The White Walker lieutenants emerged, blue eyes sweeping the carnage. White surged in a second wave, pressing the defenders deeper into the courtyard. But in that fateful moment, Gendry loaded another bolt, a massive dragon-glass warhead, onto the ballista. He cranked the lever with every ounce of strength. Below, Arya fought to hold the Night King's attention. She feinted left, sprang right, narrowly avoiding a killing blow from an ice spear conjured by one of the lieutenants. Meanwhile, the yard erupted in a melee of swirling swords, swirling flames, swirling hope and despair. Adeline turned to Gendry, helping him aim. Her hands trembled, sweat freezing on her brow. The ballista creaked as they angled it downward, locking onto the tall, pale figure in the midst of swirling ice. Now, they released the bolt. For a moment, it seemed to vanish into the chaos. The Night King sensed the attack at the last instant, spinning to conjure an icy shield. But this was no ordinary projectile. Gendry's blacksmith ingenuity had combined dragonglass shards, bound together with steel, forging a spinning monstrous spearhead. The bolt tore through the swirling frost, defying the ephemeral barrier. A sound like cracking glaciers echoed through the courtyard. The dragonglass bolt struck the Night King square in the chest. He staggered, eyes wide with that ancient, malevolent light. A hush gripped both living and dead in that suspended breath of time. Then fractures of pale blue spread across his torso like cracks in the surface of a frozen lake. Arya, seizing the moment, lunged forward. With a savage thrust, she drove her Valyrian dagger into the fissure on his chest. A shriek reverberated across the yard, not from the Night King's lips, he made no sound, but from the very air around him, as if winter itself howled in pain. The cracks multiplied, splintering in all directions. Then, in a burst of ice crystals, the Night King shattered. For a second, time itself felt still. Then his White Walker lieutenants began to crumble, their forms splintering like delicate sculptures. The whites collapsed, lifeless once more, scattering into the snow. Harrenhal's courtyard fell silent, save for the ragged breathing of the living. The unstoppable tide had been stopped. Arya fell to her knees, exhausted. Tormund let out a roar of triumph that caught in his throat, half laugh, half sob. Brienne sank to the ground, tears streaming down her cheeks. Davos closed his eyes, lips moving in a silent prayer. Adelin and Gendry stared down from the tower, hardly believing what they had witnessed. The dead were gone. It was over. Relief flooded the survivors, but it came coupled with sorrow for all that had been lost. Harrenhal's courtyard was a graveyard of bodies, the stench of blood and fire thick in the air. Yet they lived. In the following days, word spread that across Westeros the whites had crumbled. The once roving hordes now lay motionless. Something in the land shifted as if a long-held breath were finally released. Slowly, precariously, the living emerged from ruins and hideouts. Across the north, across the riverlands, across all the seven kingdoms, those who had survived by luck or cunning or sheer resilience came forward to see the sun pierce the gloom. The winter did not vanish overnight, but its crushing grip began to relent. The first thaw arrived in rivulets of melting snow. At Harrenhal, a funeral pyre was built for the fallen. Survivors from countless houses attended, standing shoulder to shoulder. They lit torches and set the pyre ablaze, offering final rites to men and women who had fought bravely. Adelin watched the flames dance, remembering her father and brothers lost in the Battle of Winterfell. She closed her eyes, inhaling smoke, exhaling grief. There was no king to ascend the Iron Throne. King's Landing was in ruins. No overarching authority guided the realm. Yet as the days turned to weeks, the survivors found unity in rebuilding. They formed councils to distribute food, to begin planting once the ground thawed, to restore some semblance of order. People spoke of refounding old alliances, forging peace among houses that had warred for generations. For each face that gazed upon the devastation, the war for humanity's survival had taught a lesson. Petty rivalries meant nothing before the darkness. Now that they had emerged from the brink of extinction, they yearned for a gentler age. Adelin took part in these efforts, carrying messages between scattered enclaves of survivors. She traveled with Mira Reed, forging contacts with other groups that had formed in the aftermath. Sometimes they found entire villages of living souls who had hidden in deep caves or remote valleys, now cautiously coming forward. Each discovery brought a bittersweet joy, for though the population was decimated, life endured. A new generation might yet be born to see a springtime in Westeros. Occasionally, Adelin's sleep was disturbed by nightmares of the White Walkers. She would see the Night King's icy glare, reliving the heartbreak of Winterfell's fall. But each morning she rose to the knowledge that the living had prevailed in the end. Though they had paid with incalculable loss, a fragment of hope remained. In the north, rumors circulated that some might return to rebuild Winterfell. Tormund Giantsbane joked that the free folk would help raise new walls if it meant a warm place to sleep when winter returned someday. Brienne of Tarth journeyed to the ruins of King's Landing, searching for any survivors she still cared for, determined to keep her vow to protect the innocent in a new age. Arya Stark vanished once more, heading off to lands unknown, though she left behind the dagger that had slain the Night King, gifting it to Gendry as a symbol of the realm's rebirth. Davos Seaworth stayed in Harrenhal for a while, guiding the improvised government, lending his wisdom. And Adelin? She chose to follow Mira Reed northward. Some part of her needed to see Winterfell again, needed to stand at the place where everything had unraveled and know that she had survived, that humanity had survived. When at last they reached the battered gates of that ancient stronghold, the sight gutted her. The courtyard was a wasteland of debris, scattered bones, fragments of walls blackened by dragonfire and half buried in snow. Yet in the center, the old weirwood in the godwood still stood, branches crowned with white leaves. Bran Stark's fate was never confirmed, but Adelin prayed silently to the old gods, hoping his spirit might yet roam the weirwood network, an immortal witness to all that had transpired. She knelt by the ruined walls, recalling her father's laughter, the pride of the Starks, and the warm hearths that once brightened these halls. In that quiet, she felt a rush of overwhelming sorrow and, paradoxically, gratitude. The White Walkers had won the Battle of Winterfell. They had plunged the world into a near-eternal night. Countless lives had been lost. But in a final twist, the living had found a way to strike back, uniting in a desperate stand that ended the nightmare. Somehow, they had wrested survival from the jaws of certain doom. Winterfell would need to be rebuilt, stone by stone. The scars inflicted on the realm would not vanish in a single generation. Still, the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the ruined towers and fallen banners. In that gentle light, Adeline rose, tears drying on her cheeks. She looked to Mira, who smiled faintly. Together, they stepped into the hushed courtyard, footprints marking fresh paths in the thawing snow. A new story was beginning, one of rebuilding, reconciliation, and remembering the dead whose sacrifices paved the way. Where the White Walkers had once stood unchallenged, only silence remained. And from that silence, on the threshold of unthinkable loss, the living began anew. Adeline felt like she was walking in a dream as she and Mira stepped through the rubble-strewn courtyard of Winterfell. Once she had known these corridors and walls, and passing had glimpsed them when delivering rations or feeding ravens. Now the ancient castle stood a silent shell of what it had been. Sharp shards of black stone jutted from collapsed halls. The upper stories of the great keep were in ruins, and snowdrifts had piled so high in certain corridors that they resembled frozen dunes. And yet, for all the destruction, Winterfell was still here, as though the very bones of the north refused to break, no matter how violent the storm. Sunlight, thin but persistent, gleamed against ragged patches of ice, hinting that the spring was coming at last. She paused at the spot where the gates once guarded the courtyard. Remembering the chaos of the night, the White Walkers won the stronghold. There had been flames and blood, the roars of dragons locked in a deadly clash in the skies. She could still picture the way the dead had climbed the parapets, unstoppable in their hunger. The hopelessness was thick enough to choke her. This was the place where her father and brothers had vanished, either killed or claimed as whites. The memory made her chest tighten with a strange mix of sorrow and pride. Sorrow for what she had lost, pride in how far she had come, surviving to witness a day when the world dared to dream of a future again. Mira was at her side, leaning on her spear. Her Crannogman frame was slight, but her presence carried an unwavering determination. She cast a glance at Adeline, her brown eyes keen. "We'll need to clear those beams from the keep," she murmured, gesturing to a pile of broken timbers that had collapsed across a side entrance. "If we want to salvage anything inside, that's our start." Adeline nodded, swallowing the dryness in her throat. "I'll check the stables too. There might be some old tools or salvageable wood we can use to make repairs." Winterfell stables had once been robust, stocked with sturdy northern horses. The building now looked skeletal, open to the wind and snow. Threading her way around shattered fences and rotted beams, Adeline managed to find a few half-broken axes. Their steel heads rusted, but still worth resharpening. She picked them up, feeling a surge of purpose. Each small discovery was a step toward rebuilding. In her childhood, she had never imagined she would take up the role of a restorer of Winterfell, rummaging through ruins for tools. But then again, she had never imagined the dead could rise and overthrow kingdoms. She was examining the battered remains of a cartwheel when Mira joined her, accompanied by 2 more survivors from Harrenhal who had volunteered for the journey north. A man named Bannon, tall and wiry with tired blue eyes, knelt by a collapsed stall to check if any feed sacks remained intact. Next to him was Lore, a woman with scars crisscrossing her arms, signs of battles against whites. They had traveled with Adeline and Mira in a small wagon carrying basic supplies: flint, rope, dragonglass shards, salted fish. Everything else they would have to scavenge along the way, and their plan was to see how best to reestablish a livable base at Winterfell for any northerners who might return. The 4 of them worked in near silence for the better part of the morning. Only the scraping of boots on rubble, the clang of metal, and the hiss of the wind broke the hush. Adeline felt a faint ache in her shoulders from the repetitive labor, but she pressed on, clearing debris, salvaging anything that might be of use. They piled the splintered beams in one corner of the courtyard, separating the wood from the stone so that eventually they could burn what was rotten and keep what was solid. As she carried an armload of broken planks, she passed the old well. For a moment, she considered lowering a bucket, if one could be found, to see if the water was still good. That would have to wait. When at last they took a short rest, the sun had crept higher, gilding the ravaged walls with an almost tender light. Lore found a spot by the well to sit, breathing heavily. "Never thought I'd see Winterfell in this state," she said, voice edged with reverence and sadness. "My mother told me once about dancing in the great hall here years back. They always said Winterfell was the soul of the north." Mira leaned her spear against the rubble, rubbing her palms together for warmth. "That soul remains, even if battered. If the land can heal, so can its people." Adeline nodded in silent agreement. She and Mira had overheard rumors in Harrenhal that Tormund Giantsbane spoke of reuniting the free folk in the north, that Lord Jon Royce and other lords from the Vale had considered forging new alliances with the north. Many had dreams of replanting fields, restocking libraries, and reviving keeps. Perhaps Winterfell could serve as a beacon, proof that the north still stood. But it was just a dream until they could make the castle livable, or at least safe from collapse. "Let's check the library tower," Adeline said finally, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I doubt many books survived, but it's worth looking for old ledgers or anything that might help us rebuild." They returned to work. The library tower's interior was half caved in, its roof partially missing, exposing shelves to the open air. Soaked and shredded pages were scattered around the floor, fused into icy lumps. Still, some areas were protected by the angle of the rubble. They rummaged through the scattered volumes, brushing off snow and debris. Most were too damaged to read. But then, just as the day's light was waning, Adeline spotted a thick tome with a leather cover. It said, "Guess we're singed," but the binding seemed intact. Gently, she pried it free from the rubble. The faded letters on the cover read, "The Tales of the Stark Kings," compiled by Maester Lewin. Something caught in her throat as she opened it carefully, bits of ash drifting onto her gloves. The first pages were mostly stuck together, but deeper in she could see carefully recorded genealogies, accounts of old battles, descriptions of castle expansions over the centuries. This was history, a piece of the North's soul on paper. She hugged it to her chest as if it were a child. Mira stood behind her, gazing over her shoulder. "That's worth more than gold," she murmured. With painstaking care, they gathered what few salvageable scrolls and books they could, placing them in a dry corner. The wind picked up outside, rattling broken shutters against the stone walls. They knew that soon they would have to find a place to camp for the night, somewhere with enough shelter from the cold. Mira led them to the basement rooms beneath the great hall, where the stone overhead remained largely intact. Down a short flight of stairs, they found a cluster of storerooms still partially furnished with old racks and bins. One room had a door that remained intact, and though it was pitch dark inside, they could set up torches and bedrolls. This was where they decided to stay. Night fell quickly, and the cold deepened. Adeline and the others lit a small fire in the center of the storeroom using charred timbers they'd gathered from outside. The warmth was minimal, but it kept the chill at bay. Adeline took a seat close to the flames, rummaging in her pack for some dried fish. They ate in weary silence, the orange glow dancing across their faces. Thoughts drifted through her mind at the times when Winterfell's halls echoed with music and feasts. She imagined the ghosts of the old lords and ladies of House Stark passing through these corridors, judging the ruin. Bannon cleared his throat, voice raw from disuse. "I never actually set foot inside Winterfell before tonight," he admitted, glancing toward the stone ceiling as if listening for lost echoes. "I came from Saul Pans originally. Never had reason to travel this far north." Lore let out a tired chuckle. "And I never thought I'd see it like this. Gods help us, if only we had come sooner, maybe the outcome of that battle would have been different." Mira's expression grew pained. "It wouldn't have mattered. The entire realm fell, one way or another, before we managed to strike back. The dead were unstoppable until they weren't." Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the horrifying truth. Only that last gamble at Harrenhal had sealed the Night King's fate, ending the long night. Before that, so much had been lost. Adeline pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "No use dwelling on what might have been," she said softly, though she too was plagued by regrets. "We're here now. Let's do what we can to bring life back to this place." They bedded down in shifts, with one person always on watch. Though the White Walkers were gone, they had learned never to let their guard down in these dark times. Stray whites still roamed here or there, mindless husks that had not fully crumbled after their master's end. More often, human scavengers posed a threat, desperate or predatory in the lawless aftermath. But the night passed without incident, save for the low moan of wind through the ruined halls. At dawn, they resumed their labor. The first task was to ensure the walls were stable in the sections they hoped to occupy. They removed precarious rubble and braced timbers where needed. Hours slipped away as the four of them sweated despite the cold, piling stone and hauling debris. The repetitive work left Adeline's arms and back aching. She refused to stop, driven by a fierce resolve. Each stone cleared was a step toward a future she had once thought impossible. As they worked, fresh snow drifted in from broken windows. The rest of Westeros might be seeing the first signs of a true spring, but in the north, winter clung like a stubborn memory. The wind that whipped through Winterfell's yards carried a chill that felt ancient, older than the recent war, older than the walls themselves. But there were also signs of the season changing, thin icicles melting at midday, puddles forming in the courtyard, the hint of budding branches in the godwood. Adeline tried to fixate on these small wonders of renewal. On the third day, they heard a noise from beyond the gates. Mira tensed, spear in hand, while Lor strung her bow. Bannon and Adeline crouched behind fallen masonry near the courtyard. At first, it was just a voice calling out, echoing between the walls. Then the voice grew clearer, bolder. When at last the newcomers stepped into view, Adeline's heart lurched. A half-dozen figures approached, dressed in disparate garb. The man in front carried a ragged banner, a dire wolf on a tattered gray field. It took a moment for Adeline to recognize that the banner was an improvised attempt at representing House Stark. The man shouted, "Ho there! We come in peace, seeking refuge or news." His companions appeared equally travel-worn. One wore a dented breastplate bearing the sigil of House Umber, another had the black cloak of a Night's Watch ranger, though the cloak was tattered beyond recognition. They carried no visible threat, so Mira, after a quick glance at Adeline, stepped forward with her weapon lowered. "We have no quarrel with you," she called back. "Identify yourselves." "I am Halle's," said the man with the makeshift Stark banner, pressing a fist to his chest in a gesture of respect. "Former steward at Last Hearth, before everything. These are my companions. We wandered from place to place, looking for survivors. Someone said they saw people coming back to Winterfell. So we came." Adeline studied them carefully, her heart softening. They looked desperate, gaunt from hunger, but hopeful. "We're only four here," she said. "We don't have much food or warmth to spare yet, but you're welcome to share what we do have." That was all the invitation needed. The travelers shuffled inside, gazing around the courtyard with pained wonder. One of them, a woman named Halessa, let out a sharp gasp when she saw the battered gates of the great hall, whispering about how she had once visited for a harvest feast as a child. Another, the Night's Watch ranger, introduced himself simply as Pike and remained silent afterward, eyes haunted. Adeline watched them with mingled pity and admiration. They had survived the cataclysm, braving unimaginable terrors. And here they were, still walking, still hoping. That night, their group expanded from 4 to 10. Mira scouted the area around the gates to ensure no additional parties lurked outside. Bannon and Lor set about making what meager stew they could from the supplies in their wagon, supplemented by a few roots the newcomers had scavenged. It was a thin meal, barely enough to fill half their bellies. Yet the moment felt momentous. They lit a small fire in the old kitchens, once the domain of dedicated cooks and storehouses brimming with salted meat. Now the hearth was blackened, the roof above it partly open to the sky. But the presence of more living souls brought a feeling that had been absent since Adeline's arrival: community. Halle set the battered Stark banner on a makeshift pole near the rubble. "I thought maybe if anyone else is out there, they'll see this and know that Winterfell's no longer abandoned," he explained, voice quivering with emotion. "They'll know they can come home." Adeline glanced at Mira, who returned her gaze with a half-smile. Neither spoke, but they both felt the same cautious optimism stirring. Winterfell had always been a symbol of northern unity. If others recognized that symbol, perhaps they would join in rebuilding, bringing more hands, more supplies, more knowledge. It would be a long road, but at least it was a road that led somewhere. After so many months of aimless wandering and desperate survival, having a shared purpose felt like standing in sunlight after a bitter cold night. In the following days, the newcomers proved invaluable. Halessa was handy with a hammer, assisting Bannon in fashioning braces to prop up sagging doorways. Pike, though quiet, had knowledge of hunting and foraging. He disappeared for half a day into the surrounding woods and returned with a pair of squirrels and a small bag of edible lichens. Halle's organized a system of watches ensuring that at least 2 people stood guard day and night. Though the White Walkers were gone, other dangers remained. Wolves roamed, and stories persisted of scattered whites that sometimes stirred in lonely barrows, reanimated only partially by lingering magic. One crisp morning, Adeline decided to search the crypts beneath Winterfell. She was not alone. Mira volunteered to join her, as did Pike and Halessa. They carried torches, descending the stone steps into the silent depths where the statues of ancient Stark kings and lords loomed in eerie vigil. Adeline's heart thumped heavily, for these crypts held centuries of legacy, and they also held the fresh memory of the disastrous night of the Battle of Winterfell. Rumor had it that the dead had stirred even in these crypts, attacking those who sought refuge. She swallowed her apprehension and led the way, torch held high. Their footsteps echoed on the cold floor. The crypt air smelled of dust, damp stone, and faint decay. They passed tomb after tomb, each marked by a carved likeness of its occupant. Old kings of winter, lords of the north, and their kin were arrayed in silent rows. Some passages were partially collapsed. Adeline felt a chill that was not entirely due to the temperature. Here was the deep history of the Starks, and they were treading upon it like intruders. Yet it was necessary to see what, if anything, could be salvaged. Near the end of one corridor, they found signs that part of the ceiling had fallen in, revealing a hidden chamber beyond. Stones lay cracked, forming a jagged opening large enough for a person to crawl through. Adeline passed her torch through the gap to see if it was safe. Mira ducked first, spearing the gloom with her weapon in front of her. Pike and Halessa followed, while Adeline brought up the rear. Inside was a small space that looked like it had been sealed for a long time. Dust and cobwebs clung to the walls, and the floor was littered with broken stones. At first, it seemed empty. Then Halessa called softly, "There's something here." She pointed to a stone chest set against one wall, carved with dire wolves. Though the chest was half buried in rubble, they could see that it was locked with a metal clasp, rusted shut. It took them a few tries, but Pike managed to pry the lid open using a short crowbar. Within lay a mound of old fabric that disintegrated at the slightest touch, along with a few glimmers of metal. Carefully, they peeled back the decaying cloth to reveal a sword of Valyrian steel. Its blade was dark, etched with ripples that shimmered in the torchlight. A pommel shaped like a wolf's head stared back at them, eyes set with small chips of garnet. All 4 of them gasped, breath-catching at the sheer rarity of such a weapon. Though some Valyrian blades still existed in Westeros, many had been lost in the chaos of the undead invasion. Adeline felt a tingle up her spine. A blade such as this was beyond value. It was history, yes, but it was also a tangible tool, one that could fell White Walkers if they still existed, or whites, or any foe. "Who might it have belonged to?" she asked, voice hushed. Mira brushed away more of the rotten cloth. "Likely an ancient Stark sword. Longclaw was Mormont steel. Ice was their ancestral great sword, but that was supposedly taken apart by House Lannister years back. This could be a different one, hidden away. Or maybe a fragment of ice reforged into a smaller blade. So many stories swirl around these walls, it's hard to say." Pike lifted the sword carefully, testing the weight in his hands. Despite the centuries, the steel felt as true as ever, no hint of rust, gleaming in the wavering torchlight. He offered it to Adeline with a respectful bow of his head, as if sensing that she, more than anyone here, had become the caretaker of Winterfell's restoration. She reached out and gripped the wolf's head pommel. The metal was icy cold, sending another shiver through her. A wave of emotion tightened her throat, pride, awe, sadness, all at once. This sword symbolized the duty of the North, a lineage of protectors that had endured horrors across the ages. Now it was in her hands. They wrapped the blade in fresh cloth and carried it up to the surface. Word spread quickly among the small band of survivors. Halle's insisted that Adeline keep it. "You found it," he said. "You and Mira lead us. The rest of us follow." His tone held no resentment, only a profound respect. Adeline tried to protest that she was no highborn lady, but the others disagreed. In their eyes, she was the closest thing Winterfell had to a guiding voice now that the Starks themselves were gone or scattered. Adeline swallowed back her reservations and accepted the sword, promising she would wield it for the good of them all. And wield it she soon did. A few evenings later, while on watch atop a partially repaired wall, Adeline spotted movement near the old broken gate. In the dim twilight, she made out the silhouettes of 3 figures staggering across the courtyard. At first, she thought them more survivors. But then she saw the unnatural jerk of their limbs, the milky eyes that glinted in the half-light, and her stomach lurched. They were whites. That realization jolted her with a terror she had almost forgotten since the Night King's downfall. But she wasted no time. She sounded the alarm, and those who were able came running with torches and dragonglass-dipped spears. Mira reached the gate first, blocking the whites from venturing deeper into the courtyard. One white wore half-rotten armor bearing teeth that seemed locked in a perpetual snarl. Another clutched a broken sword in skeletal fingers. The third was smaller, perhaps once a child. The sight of it tore at Adeline's heart even as dread coursed through her veins. She sprinted across the rubble, unsheathing the Valyrian steel sword. It caught the last rays of sunlight, glimmering with a harsh beauty. Mira braced her spear, calling over her shoulder, "Try to drive them out into open space. Don't let them corner anyone." Bannon flanked her, brandishing a torch to keep the creatures at bay. The whites hissed, eyes flicking from one living person to another, then lunged with shocking speed. Adeline slashed at the first white, cleaving bone and rotted flesh. The blade moved almost effortlessly, slicing through the undead's torso. A surge of grim triumph washed over her. Valyrian steel truly was a wonder. The white staggered, collapsed, and began to twitch before going still, black ichor pooling beneath it. Lore fired an arrow at the second white, hitting its skull with a crack. However, the undead soldier kept advancing, brandishing the broken sword at Mira. With a bark of effort, Mira swept her dragonglass spear tip across the white's neck. The creature reeled, flailing. Pike moved in for the finishing stab, driving the spearhead into its skull. In a heartbeat, it went limp. That left the smaller white. It skittered away with unsettling agility, circling behind a broken cart. Adeline's pulse thundered. She could see scraps of clothing still clinging to the figure's limbs. The partial face looked more like a twisted mask. She wanted to close her eyes, remembering children in Winterfell from her past, laughing in the courtyard, chasing after each other in a game of tag. But if she hesitated, someone would die. She advanced slowly, sword raised. The white scrambled around the corner, and she followed. It leapt at her with a hoarse shriek. Adeline met it midair with a slash. The blade cut through the creature's torso, and the force sent her stumbling backward. The white collapsed in a heap of half-frozen gore. She fell to one knee, panting, eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. Mira checked the courtyard, spear still in hand, tension carved into her every movement. "Any more?" she asked, voice echoing off the broken walls. Bannon and Lore glanced around with torches raised, but the courtyard was otherwise empty. Slowly, the watchers relaxed. Adeline slid the sword back into its makeshift leather scabbard, trembling slightly. She realized how quickly her mind had reverted to the old terror. The whites might have lost their master, but some still roamed aimlessly, clinging to unholy reanimation until they were destroyed. At least they were fewer and no longer part of an organized legion. But it was a reminder that the realm's troubles had not vanished with the Night King's death. The living would need vigilance for a long time to come. That night, as they disposed of the white corpses by burning them in the courtyard, a somber mood settled over everyone. Some turned away, unwilling to gaze upon the small figure in the flames. Adeline forced herself to watch, steel-faced, until the embers faded and the bodies were ash. She felt Mira's hand on her shoulder. Neither spoke. There were no words that could soften the horror of what this world had endured. Nevertheless, news of Winterfell's reoccupation trickled out through word of mouth and travelers. Over the next week, more survivors appeared, drawn by the promise of a gathering place in the north. Some carried seeds and simple tools, hoping to plant in the spring. Others brought nothing but the clothes on their backs and the grief in their eyes. Among them were a few from the deep northern mountains, a couple from the White Knife region, and even a family that had fled the fall of the Dread Fort. Each arrival found a cautious welcome and an unspoken question: will we have enough food and shelter for everyone? Despite the hardships, Adeline and the others pressed on. The main priority became to clear the courtyard of debris so that new arrivals could set up tents or temporary lean-tos. Hallie's built an improvised smithy near the corner of the yard, collecting scraps of metal to reforge nails, hinges, or arrowheads. Pike and a newly arrived hunter named Rika ventured into the surrounding forests to find game. They rarely returned empty-handed, though the hares and foxes they caught provided only modest meals when spread among so many. On a chilly afternoon, Adeline noticed that the gloom in the sky had thinned. A pale sun shone through tatters of cloud. The air felt milder, and rivulets of water trickled from the rooftops. She stood by the half-repaired gate, watching the meltwater drip. Could it be that spring was truly coming at last? Her heart lifted at the possibility. The land still bore scars from the endless night, and even a full, vibrant spring would not erase the devastation. But it might make survival less tenuous. A murmur rose from a group near the newly raised Stark banner. Adeline turned and saw that more newcomers had arrived, led by a tall, flame-haired figure. Tormund Giantsbane. She recognized him from Harrenhal, though they had never spoken much. He came with a handful of free folk, hardy men and women dressed in furs, carrying massive axes and bows. There were also a few southern faces in the group, evidently strays who had found their way north under Tormund's protection. Tormund's booming voice echoed across the yard. "Ha! They told me folks were restoring Winterfell. Didn't believe it until I saw that banner. Thought it might be a trap, but no trap I know of. Welcomes ragged souls with an open gate. Good to see you again, little crow." He winked at Pike, who stiffened at the playful insult. Tormund laughed and clapped a hand on the ranger's shoulder. Adelin stepped forward, greeting him. "Welcome. We're doing what we can. It's not much, but it's something." Tormund's gaze roved over the broken walls, the half-built lean-tos, the battered great hall. He let out a slow exhalation. "I seen better days, but if I didn't believe in lost causes, I wouldn't still be alive, would I?" He snorted, then glanced around. "We heard news along the road. People talk of gathering in the north. Something about rebuilding a new world in the old castles, forging alliances. I don't hold much with your Kneeler politics, but I do believe in a place that's safe from roving whites or bandits. So here we are." With that, the free folk joined the ranks of Winterfell's survivors. Tormund and his people immediately made themselves useful, hauling massive stones with ease, constructing sturdy wooden frames for living spaces. They had survived the harshness beyond the wall, and though their numbers were drastically reduced by the war, those who remained were as tough as the northern mountains themselves. Adelin found her admiration for them growing. She had spent her early life hearing only rumors about the wildlings, told they were savage raiders. Now she saw that they were simply people who had fought to live outside the feudal structures of the south. 3 nights after Tormund's arrival, they held a communal meal in the great hall, what remained of it. The roof overhead was riddled with holes, and a large chunk of the floor had collapsed into a lower cellar. Nevertheless, they laid out a few long tables supported by salvaged planks and lit a fire in what was left of the central hearth. Scattered braziers from the old armory added more warmth. People brought whatever they had: dried meats, foraged greens, even a few battered tankards of ale discovered in a hidden storeroom. It was not a feast by any stretch, but it was the largest gathering in Winterfell since the cataclysmic battle. Adelin found herself seated among a ragtag group that included Mira, Tormund, Halessa, Bannon, Lore, and others. The flicker of firelight played across their faces, revealing tired lines and fresh scars. Yet conversation flowed, tentative laughter broke out, and for a brief moment, the hall felt almost festive. Tormund regaled them with half-true stories from beyond the wall, his loud guffaws echoing among the rafters. Mira, in turn, spoke of her travels with Bran Stark and the mystical powers she had witnessed in the far north. Many listened with wide eyes. Halessa leaned closer to Adelin, voice low. "If we continue to grow in number, we'll need someone to lead," she said quietly, glancing around. "Not just coordinate labor, but truly lead. Winterfell has always been the seat of House Stark. With them gone or scattered, folks might look to you." Adelin stiffened. "I'm no lady of Winterfell. I was the 3rd child of a minor house. I barely even knew." "You're the one who took up the rebuilding," Halessa interrupted. "The one who found that sword. People see you carrying it around. They trust you. Maybe you don't want to rule, but you can't ignore that you're guiding us day by day." Adelin opened her mouth to protest again, but the words died in her throat. She had guided, yes, but only because no one else had stepped forward. She had felt duty press upon her shoulders in a manner she had never asked for. The notion that she might need to continue in that role, perhaps more formally, made her heart pound. Yet Halessa's words struck a chord. In the new, shattered world, the old lines of succession and heraldry were blurred. People just wanted someone who could keep them alive and who wouldn't abuse that power. Adelin swallowed, then gave a hesitant nod. "We'll see," she whispered. As the meal ended and the fires burned low, Adelin withdrew to one corner of the hall, glancing up at the dark sky through a gap in the roof. Stars twinkled in the crisp night. Mira joined her, leaning her spear against a fallen beam. "You look troubled," Mira observed. Adelin chuckled without humor. "Just thinking about how strange all of this is. I never imagined I'd be in this position. Or that Winterfell could become home to free folk, ex-King's Landing refugees, ex-Night's Watch Rangers, and so many other souls all mixing together." Mira nodded, a slight smile on her lips. "The world is changed. For better or worse, we have a chance to shape it." She paused, then added softly, if you need help carrying the burden, you know I'm here. I've lost everyone I was sworn to protect, everything I ever knew. But I haven't lost my desire to do what's right. Emotion swelled in Adeline's chest. She reached out and took Mira's hand, squeezing gently. I know, she murmured. Thank you. For a moment, they just stood together, gazing at the broken majesty of Winterfell. In that hushed space, amid the distant murmur of voices, Adeline felt a small spark of something like hope, delicate yet persistent. By day, that hope was put to work. The winter snows grew patchier, revealing muddy ground beneath. Small patches of grass clung to life near the godwood. Some said they saw new buds forming on the ancient weirwood's branches, which had always retained leaves even in winter. The survivors built raised platforms for sleeping in the dryness of the great keep's upper floors, those that remained stable, and used what timber they had to mend holes in the roofing. In an extraordinary stroke of luck, Tormund's people discovered an abandoned cache of grain in a hidden subbasement, possibly placed there by the old castellan before the battle. While some of the sacks were spoiled, enough were salvageable to supplement their rations. Each morning, Adeline walked the perimeter of the walls with a group of watchers, checking for weak points or signs of intrusion. One such morning, while scanning the countryside, she saw something surprising. Far off, beyond the scorched fields, a large caravan winding its way up the King's Road. The lead figures carried standards that fluttered in the breeze. One looked like the moon-and falcon of House Arryn. Another bore a golden lion over white. Adeline's stomach lurched at the sight of the lion, symbol of House Lannister. What business would Lannisters have in the north, especially now? She alerted Mira and Tormund, who organized a cautious reception. A line of defenders armed with spears and bows formed just inside the gates. Adeline stood at the forefront, the Valyrian steel sword at her hip, feeling her pulse quicken. As the caravan approached, she saw at least 20 or 30 people, many of them in battered armor. Leading them was a woman with short-cropped brown hair, wearing the Arryn sigil on a travel-stained cloak. Beside her rode a younger man with sandy hair, wearing a Lannister lion on his tunic, though the garment was torn and patched. They halted a short distance from the gates. The woman lifted a hand in greeting. We come in peace, seeking shelter and alliance. I am Ser Alice Royce, niece to the late Lord Yon Royce of the Vale. This is Martin Lannister, once of Casterly Rock. We travel with survivors from the Vale, the Riverlands, and the Westerlands. We heard Winterfell was becoming a safe haven. Tormund scoffed loudly, crossing his arms. Lannisters. Didn't expect to see one alive, let alone riding politely to our doorstep. Martin Lannister, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle, called back, I assure you, we pose no threat. My house fell with King's Landing and the subsequent chaos. There is nothing left for us in the Westerlands. We've lost everything. Ser Alice has taken the lead in guiding us north. We only hope for a place where we might contribute. Adeline exchanged a look with Mira, who gave a slight nod. The truth was, they needed more people for the rebuilding, and the reality of this new world was that old feuds mattered less. The question was whether these newcomers could be trusted. Adeline stepped forward, raising a hand for quiet. We welcome any survivors who come in peace, she said, projecting her voice. But know that here, we all work together. No one stands above the rest by birthright alone. If you can accept that, then enter, and we'll share what little we have. Ser Alice Royce dismounted, kneeling briefly in a gesture of respect. We understand. I swear on the honor of my house, we will abide by your rules and work for the common good. Martin Lannister also dismounted, albeit less gracefully. His eyes darted around at the battered walls, the mix of free folk and southerners, the newly raised Stark banner fluttering above. Adeline could see the weariness in his posture, the longing for acceptance. She gestured for them to approach, heart-pounding. Once House Lannister had been among the most powerful in Westeros. Now a single scion came begging shelter. How times had changed. That day, Winterfell's population nearly doubled. Tents and wagons filled the courtyard, and the great hall bustled with activity. There were knights of the Vale, sworn swords of House Royce, a handful of Lannister men-at-arms who had survived the undead in the Westerlands, and even some scattered families who had latched onto the caravan for protection. It was a precarious expansion, for resources were still painfully limited. Yet the fresh influx of labor and knowledge could help accelerate repairs. Ser Alice Royce seemed both pragmatic and honorable. She offered what supplies her people had stored: grains from the Vale, dried meats, some seeds for planting. We planned to try re-establishing the Eyrie, but it was in such a state that we ran out of resources. Word reached us that Harrenhal was coordinating survivors, so we made for the Riverlands. But we heard along the way that Winterfell was rising again, so we turned north. She paused, glancing at Adeline's sword. I see you carry Valyrian steel. Are you of House Stark? No, Adeline said softly, meeting her gaze. But I stand for Winterfell, for what it meant and still means to the people of the North. This blade, we found it hidden in the crypts, likely a relic from House Stark's lineage. I only bear it until a true Stark returns. If one ever does. Alice nodded in understanding, not pressing the matter further. Instead, she helped Tormund, Mira, and others organize a plan for farmland outside the castle walls. Even though the ground was still partly frozen, they meant to clear fields for planting as soon as possible. Martin Lannister, for his part, volunteered to assist with forging alliances to the west. I know some lesser houses that might still be clinging to life in the Westerlands, he explained. If we can reach them, we could bring more survivors north. They might have livestock or seeds. He hesitated, as if uncertain how his words would be received, and then pressed on, I understand how people may feel about my house. But I give you my word, I seek only the realm's recovery. Adeline listened carefully. She saw in him the glimmer of a man who had lost his pride along with his family's dominion. What remained was humility and a willingness to help. She granted him permission to form a small expedition, provided that any who left for the Westerlands did so at their own risk and did not make promises in Winterfell's name they couldn't keep. Martin agreed, bowing stiffly. Such negotiations became the new norm. Day by day, Winterfell's population grew, forging a fragile community out of what had once been mortal enemies: free folk, Lannisters, Vale Knights, scattered northerners. They all toiled to stabilize the castle. Walls were shored up, collapsed halls cleared, storerooms inventoried. Each sunset saw them huddled around fires, telling stories of the past, sometimes laughing, more often weeping for all they had lost. One dusk, Adeline found herself standing on the old battlements, gazing at the horizon. She wrapped her cloak tighter against the chill. In the courtyard below, torches and lanterns glimmered like fireflies in the twilight. She remembered how, not long ago, this space was silent, haunted by the memory of defeat. Now it bustled with life, however tenuous. Her thoughts drifted to those who had perished in the Battle of Winterfell. She wondered, if they could see this moment, would they find solace in the knowledge that their home was stirring back to life? She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Mira approach. The crannogwoman glanced over the wall, nodding in approval at the makeshift village that had grown within Winterfell's perimeter. It's beginning to feel like a real home again, she said softly. Adeline nodded, swallowing a sudden lump in her throat. We've come so far. But there's still so much to do. She paused, remembering Halessa's words about leadership. I worry that we might not have enough supplies to get everyone through next winter. And I worry about bandits, rogue whites, or petty lords who might try to take this place by force. Mira placed a hand on her shoulder. Your concerns are valid, but you're not facing them alone. Look at all of us gathered here. People who once fought on opposite sides of countless wars are now working side by side, united by the simple desire to live. That's new. That's something precious. A gentle breeze brushed across the battlements, carrying a hint of pine from the nearby forests. Adeline exhaled, letting the quiet reassurance of Mira's presence calm her racing thoughts. Far below, she saw Tormund showing some wide-eyed southerners how to properly construct a windbreak for their tents, roaring with laughter when they stumbled. She saw Lore organizing a hunting party near the gates, while Hallie stood vigil with the battered Stark banner. Before the war against the dead, alliances were forged by marriage or military might. Now, alliances were forged by shared survival and the recognition that none could rebuild alone. In a way, Adeline mused, that was truer and more honest than any political arrangement in the old days. Maybe this was how the realm would mend, piece by broken piece, hearts open to cooperation rather than conquest. That night, she hardly slept. Visions of the future warred with echoes of the past in her mind. She saw fields ripe with golden wheat, merchants traveling the roads again, children laughing in the courtyards, a new generation unaware of the horrors their parents had endured. But she also saw the face of the small white she killed, its half-rotted features twisted by unnatural life. The nightmares might never fully leave her. Yet neither would her resolve. Morning light found her in the godwood, kneeling beside the heart tree. The ancient weirwood's carved face, with red sapphire eyes, seemed to watch her with an otherworldly serenity. She closed her eyes, murmuring a wordless prayer, a prayer of thanks for survival, of mourning for the dead, and of hope for the future. The quiet hush of the godwood enveloped her, broken only by a soft rustle of leaves. She placed a hand on the trunk, feeling the rough bark beneath her palm, imagining the countless generations of Starks who had prayed here before her. She wasn't one of them, but she felt their legacy coursing through the old roots, up into the living wood, bridging the past and the present. At length she rose, steeling herself for the day's tasks. A group of volunteers was setting out to the gift region hoping to salvage seeds and maybe find stray livestock. Another group would be riding south to the Neck, checking if the Crannogmen lands had anything to spare. Adelin had to meet with Ser Alice Royce to discuss fortifying the old towers, then speak with Tormund about forging a new system of leadership so that every faction felt represented. The tasks were endless, but she found purpose in them. Day by day, week by week, Winterfell inched toward stability. The battered towers began to appear less desolate once scaffolding and new timber frames offered support. The ragged tents in the courtyard were gradually replaced with huts and small wooden shelters that ringed the yard, each fitted with makeshift chimneys. The survivors scoured every corner of the castle for forgotten supplies, repairing what they could. They even managed to partially restore the castle's glass greenhouse, an old structure once used to grow exotic herbs, bringing in new cuttings that might provide fresh food year-round. As the sun rose higher each day, the land thawed. Meltwater streamed through Winterfell's drainage channels. The sky lost some of its oppressive grayness, revealing a brilliant cerulean expanse on clear afternoons. Birds returned, their songs weaving hopeful notes into the air. For many, these signs of renewal were as wondrous as magic. Some said the old gods were blessing them for daring to stand again. Others chalked it up to nature's inevitable cycle. Either way, it brought joy to hearts grown weary of endless winter. One afternoon, while overseeing the reconstruction of the outer gate, Adelin noticed a commotion near the King's Road approach. Lore came running, her face alight with excitement. "Riders from Harrenhal," she exclaimed. "They're here. Ser Davos is with them and someone else." Adelin's breath caught. Could it be Brienne? Arya Stark? Some other figure from the south? She rushed to the courtyard, heart hammering. The gates were still being rebuilt, but a small portion had been hinged, allowing a few riders to pass. In they came, a company of about a dozen led by the unmistakable Davos Seaworth. Behind him rode a tall woman with golden hair, wearing battered armor, Brienne of Tarth. Adelin's eyes flicked to the other figures, a cluster of men and women wearing mismatched clothing, some with a sigil of a flaming heart, others with the Tully fish, and even a couple who looked like they hailed from the Stormlands. At the rear was a slight figure in a hooded cloak. They halted in the courtyard. Davos dismounted, an expression of weary relief on his face. "So it's true," he breathed, taking in the newly fortified walls. "Winterfell stands again." Adelin stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "Welcome, Ser Davos. And you, Lady Brienne." She inclined her head in respect. Then, unable to help herself, she asked, "Who else do you bring?" Before Davos could answer, the hooded figure dismounted, stepping forward on unsteady feet. A slender hand reached up and pulled back the hood, revealing the face beneath. Adelin felt a jolt of recognition. Sansa Stark, her hair a duller red than Adelin remembered from tales, cheeks sunken, eyes rimmed with fatigue, but very much alive. For an instant, the courtyard went silent. People froze, staring at the one who had once been Lady of Winterfell. Sansa's eyes flickered over the crowd, resting on the battered Stark banner, the half-repaired Great Hall, the swirl of armed men and women, the new huts. Emotion contorted her features and tears welled in her eyes. Slowly, she sank to her knees, pressing a hand against the cold cobblestones. She was home at last, but Winterfell was changed beyond measure. Brienne moved to assist her, but Sansa shook her head, swallowing. I'm all right," she managed, voice trembling. She lifted her gaze to Adelin, Mira, Tormund, and all the others now gathered. "You've done so much," she said, wonder and grief mingling in her tone. "I'm grateful. Truly." Adelin stepped closer, her mind reeling. This was a Stark in Winterfell, the rightful lady if any official line still stood. She sank into a respectful bow, heart thudding so loudly she could barely think. The sword at her hip sudden. Ly felt heavy as though it radiated all the centuries of Stark heritage. "My lady," she murmured. A hush spread across the courtyard. Then Tormund, with his characteristic irreverence, sparked a laugh. "No need for all that kneeling and bowing. We've all been through hell. Let's welcome the lady with warm food and a seat by the fire, eh?" Sansa blinked, wiping away tears, and a faint smile touched her lips. "I'd like that," she whispered. They led her inside, clearing space in the Great Hall's newly repaired portion. Ser Davos and Brienne explained in hushed tones how they had found Sansa after the fall of King's Landing, where she had been captured by straggling Lannister soldiers who'd hoped to trade her for safe passage. Brienne had rescued her, and over the months they drifted through the chaos of the south until word reached them that Harrenhal was safe. From there, they'd mustered the courage to travel north, despite the dangers. Now, seeing Winterfell reborn left Sansa overwhelmed with relief. All that afternoon, the courtyard buzzed with the news. A Stark had returned. Some wondered if Sansa would immediately assume leadership, displacing Adeline and the loose structure they had established. Others were simply joyful that House Stark was not extinct. Adeline herself felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, joy that a true Stark had come home, relief that the burden might be shared, and a twinge of fear that her role could be rendered obsolete or that Sansa might have a different vision for Winterfell's future. When Sansa had taken some time to rest, she asked Adeline and Mira to meet her in a small side room that had been converted into a kind of war council chamber. The meeting was intimate, just the three of them, plus Davos and Brienne standing discreetly near the entrance. Sansa sat on a crude wooden chair that served as a makeshift seat of honor, though she looked more weary than regal. She nodded for Adeline to speak first. Adeline did so, recounting how she and Mira had arrived, how they found others, how they uncovered the Valyrian steel sword in the crypts, how they slowly rebuilt. She explained the improvised systems of labor, the influx of survivors from across Westeros, the scarcity of food, the presence of a few roving whites. Sansa listened intently, her hands folded in her lap, her expression grave. She asked questions about the defunct castles in the north, about the scattered families who might still claim them. Mira contributed her knowledge of the Neck and the Crannogmen, while Davos interjected bits of information gleaned from the south. At last, Sansa stood, crossing to where Adeline sat. Adeline rose too, uncertain. The younger woman, though older than Adeline by a handful of years, placed a gentle hand on the hilt of the Valyrian steel sword at Adeline's belt. She didn't draw it, simply touched it. "You said you found this in the crypts. Belonging to my ancestors." "Yes," Adeline replied, her voice catching. "We believed it was best guarded by someone dedicated to Winterfell. But if you wish to claim," Sansa shook her head, "you wielded it in defense of this castle. You deserve to keep it. I'm not a fighter, and I've had my fill of steel. If it eases your burden, keep carrying it. In my name, in House Stark's name, if that matters." Her voice trembled with a quiet vulnerability. "I'm not here to strip you of what you've built. Without you, there might be no Winterfell to return to." Relief flooded Adeline so profoundly that her knees felt weak. "Thank you," she whispered. "But the people are used to looking to me for decisions. Many are afraid old feuds could arise. Now that you're here, we need clarity." Sansa took a slow breath, her eyes reflecting old traumas. "I've been a prisoner, a pawn in the games of great houses, sold off by one foe to another. I don't wish to reign in tyranny over survivors who have fought so hard. I only want to see the North strong again, the realm safe for all who've suffered." She paused, searching Adeline's gaze. "Will you help me build that future? Together?" The words left Adeline almost speechless. She bowed her head, overwhelmed. "Of course," she managed. "My lady, I'll serve as best I can. I can think of no better path forward than standing with you." Sansa's shoulders relaxed slightly, a faint smile softening her somber features. "Then let us stand together. If House Stark still has meaning, it's in protecting the North and all its people, no matter their origins." Brienne and Davos exchanged approving nods. Mira watched quietly, satisfaction flickering in her eyes. The moment felt like a culmination, past and present twining together, forging a new direction. Outside, the sun dipped low, bathing the great hall walls in golden light. Through the battered windows, Adeline could hear the sounds of industry in the courtyard. Hammering voices calling to each other, the shuffle of weary feet. Life, it filled her with a fierce resolve. In the days that followed, Sansa and Adeline jointly addressed the assembled populace. Sansa spoke of her gratitude for the tireless efforts that made Winterfell livable again, for the walls that sheltered the vulnerable and the fields that would soon feed the hungry. She pledged herself to the well-being of all who chose to call this place home, be they from the north, the Vale, the Westerlands, the Free Folk, or anywhere else. Adeline added her voice, affirming that the success of Winterfell thus far had been a communal effort, and so it must remain, a place where no one was turned away if they came peacefully. A cheer rose, subdued by the gravity of their circumstances, but heartfelt nonetheless. Tormund roared loudest, followed by a mix of Vale Knights and Lannister survivors. Even the quiet watchers on the walls raised their spears in solidarity. That night, a renewed sense of purpose coursed through Winterfell. Where divisions might have flared, unity prevailed, guided by Sansa's calm leadership and Adelin's steadfast support. Survival still posed challenges. A group returning from the gift reported minimal luck in finding livestock. Bandits occasionally tested the roads, ambushing small parties. Rumors reached them that Euron Greyjoy, if he still lived, prowled the coasts in one last, battered longship raiding for supplies. A bigger fear was the approach of another winter, though it would likely be years off if the seasons returned to normal. Regardless, no one wanted to be caught unprepared again. Sansa, Adelin, Brienne, Tormund, Ser Alys Royce, and Martin Lannister sat in council regularly, hammering out decisions about ration distribution, search parties, trade attempts. More survivors trickled in every week, forming a patchwork population that tested the limits of Winterfell's meager resources. The newly sown fields around the castle began to sprout green shoots, a miracle that brought tears to many eyes. The old greenhouse thrived with herbs and leafy vegetables. Slowly, life took hold. Word spread across the realm, what was left of it. Where once ravens might have flown with official seals, now travelers carried messages by word of mouth or scribbled notes on scraps of parchment. Winterfell is open. Winterfell offers hope. The phrase reached distant corners. Some scoffed, unwilling to believe anything good still stood in the north. Others took it as a beacon in the darkness. One morning, a small caravan arrived, bearing the banners of House Manderley from White Harbor. Manderley men had survived, it turned out, clinging to the coast. They brought salted fish and news that the port city was in ruins from White attacks. But pockets of people were still there, eager to reconnect with the rest of the north. Sansa wept upon hearing that White Harbor's famed libraries had been mostly destroyed, though some archives might have been hidden. It spurred new resolve to preserve any books or knowledge they had salvaged at Winterfell. As the weeks gave way to months, the patchwork society at Winterfell solidified. Temporary shelters transformed into permanent dwellings. The Great Hall was further restored with new timbers supporting its roof. The walls that had once kept out the undead now kept out thieves or straggling horrors. Whenever a white was spotted, the Watchers dispatched it swiftly and thoroughly burned the remains. The fear that had once gripped them all lessened with each successful defense. Sansa initiated the replanting of the castle gardens, bringing color and growth to once blackened earth. Row by row, seeds were sown, nurtured by careful hands. Mira oversaw a small group who ventured to the neck, forging pacts with the surviving crannogmen to exchange fish and herbs for dragoglass and cloth. Tormund, for all his brash ways, managed relations with the free folk who roamed the far north, persuading them to come south to trade furs for tools. Adelin found herself increasingly in the role of a mediator as the population's diversity inevitably led to disputes. Whether it was a Vale Knight arguing with a Lannister man-at-arms over an old feud or a free folk hunter squabbling with a Manderley fisherman over territory, Adelin would quietly intercede, reminding them that petty rivalries had no place in this fragile new world. She found calm words came more easily to her these days, tempered by the countless tragedies behind them. People listened. The Valyrian steel sword at her side might have helped, too, its presence a silent testament to the unwavering defense of Winterfell. Sansa often joined her in these arbitrations, listening carefully, then speaking with gentle authority. Together, they struck a balance that neither overshadowed the other, forging a partnership that felt natural. Adelin realized, with some astonishment, that she and Sansa were becoming friends as well as co-stewards of this reborn stronghold. They would walk the battlements at dusk, discussing everything from the day's small troubles like a shortage of nails to the looming question of how to unite scattered pockets of the north under a single banner again. Sometimes they spoke of the future they envisioned, a fairer society, freed from old shackles of endless wars and grudges. Sansa's eyes would light up with determination, no longer shadowed by the horrors she had endured. Adelin, in turn, found hope blossoming in her chest. Of course, no rebirth is without pain. Occasionally, sorrowful tidings arrived, a report of yet another ruin discovered, a settlement wiped out by disease or leftover whites, a band of brigands marauding near the Westerlands. Sometimes the illusions of unity threatened to crack under the weight of these traumas. People still bore scars, physical and emotional. When the memories of Winterfell's fall gnawed at Adelin in her darkest hours, she would grip the old stark blade and remind herself that the living had eventually triumphed at a dreadful cost, but they had triumphed. She would not let that victory be in vain. Time slipped by, and in place of endless winter, the north felt its first warm breezes in what seemed like an age. Spring arrived in earnest, painting the fields around Winterfell with green. The sound of laughter drifted up from the courtyard one afternoon, children playing a game of tag among the fresh grass, their shrieks of delight echoing. Adeline paused to watch them from a tower window, her throat tightening with gratitude. This was what they had fought for. On the day of the first harvest from the newly tilled fields, Sansa declared a feast to celebrate. It was modest: turnips, carrots, a bit of grain, small game, but it was fresh produce grown by their own hands. The great hall filled with men, women, and children from all corners of Westeros, each with a story of loss, each now forging a new chapter together. Banners of the direwolf were hung alongside the symbols of other houses, and even the free folk contributed carved totems. Adeline sat near the high table, not as a lady of the castle, but as a recognized leader in the new order. She watched Sansa raise a cup, voice trembling with emotion as she thanked everyone who had made this possible. "To those we lost," Sansa said, her gaze sweeping across the hall. "To those who never saw this day, but whose courage paved the path. May we honor them by living, by rebuilding, by uniting." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and cups were raised. Adeline felt tears prick her eyes as she joined the toast, remembering her father and brothers, who had fought so valiantly in the doomed battle. In some small way, this moment felt like redemption. The feast concluded with music, an impromptu mix of northern fiddle and free folk drums. People danced awkwardly, but with genuine joy. Mira spun with Tormund in a hilarious mismatch of styles. Davos clapped along, and Brienne allowed herself a rare smile in the corner. Sansa eventually retired, fatigue etched on her face, but Adeline lingered, sipping from a wooden cup of cider, soaking in the warmth of the gathering. This was more than a meal. It was a triumph over despair. In the weeks that followed, the rebuilding intensified. Houses across the north cautiously sent representatives, acknowledging Sansa Stark as the rightful Lady of Winterfell. Even a few from the south recognized that power was coalescing here in the north, offering alliances to ensure trade and mutual defense. Though talk of a king or queen in the north emerged, Sansa gracefully sidestepped the idea. "Titles matter less than cooperation," she often said, a stance that won her respect from many quarters. Adeline noticed that this new approach, a more open, communal leadership, helped mend the realm's fractured psyche in ways no single monarch had ever achieved. Summer crept closer, the days stretching longer. The farmland around Winterfell burgeoned with crops, the greenhouse thrived, and a slow but steady trickle of trade began once more along the King's Road. Merchants, startled to find survivors thriving in the once desolate land, spoke of possibilities. Shipping goods from White Harbor to the Vale, exchanging building materials for fish and grain. The roads remained treacherous, but a sense of renewed normalcy was dawning. Occasionally, Adeline would take time to walk the castle alone, recalling the ghosts of what had been. She would stand in the courtyard where she had first arrived after the battle, seeing it now brimming with stalls, workshops, laughter. She would pass through the old stables, where living horses now outnumbered the ruins of the past. She would climb the library tower, partially restored, where they had painstakingly dried and preserved the books that survived. Each location was like a bookmark in her memory, a testimony to how far they had come. Sometimes the weight of it nearly brought her to her knees. They had taken a place synonymous with total defeat and made it a beacon of hope. One warm afternoon, while crossing the yard, she spotted a lone figure standing by a cart of supplies. The figure turned, and Adeline's breath caught in her throat. It was Tom, the companion she had believed lost in a blizzard so many months ago. He looked thinner, with a ragged beard, and his eyes reflected a haunted story she could only guess at. For a heartbeat, she thought she was dreaming. But then he recognized her, and an incredulous joy lit his face. They met in the middle of the courtyard, neither able to speak at first. At last, Adeline choked out, "You're alive." How is this possible?" Tom's eyes watered. "Got lost in that storm. Woke up in a ruined farmhouse. Wandered for days, weeks maybe. Eventually fell in with a small group of travelers heading east. We heard rumors of Harrenhal, then rumors of Winterfell. I kept going until I found it." He paused, swallowing hard. "I never thought I'd see you again." Adeline reached out and clutched his arm. There's so much to tell you." She felt an odd swirl of relief, guilt, and happiness. When she had lost Tom, she had assumed the worst. Now he was here, living proof that sometimes miracles defied the bleakness. The noise of daily hustle surrounded them, people calling for tools, children giggling, the ring of a hammer in the smithy. Amid that life, they stood quietly marveling at each other's survival. "Looks like you've been busy," Tom said softly, taking in the bustling courtyard. He then noticed the Valyrian steel sword at her side, eyebrows arching. You lead them, don't you?" Adeline gave a bashful shrug. "Not alone. Sansa Stark returned and we all share the burden. But yes, in a way." She let out a shaky laugh, tears threatening to spill. "Didn't see that coming, did we?" Tom shook his head, an affectionate smile creasing his weathered face. "No. But I'm glad. So damned glad." They embraced, the swirl of old friendship and new beginnings enveloping them in the heart of Winterfell's renewed vigor. Nearby, Mira spotted them and grinned, beckoning them to come help carry supplies. Life moved forward. Adeline guided Tom through the castle, reintroducing him to old acquaintances and new allies. Each step reminded her of the first night she stumbled through these halls, terrified and alone. Now she moved with purpose, a caretaker of a place that had once seemed doomed. Season after season, the North mended. Farms multiplied, roads cleared, trade routes connected to the Vale, the Riverlands, even some parts of the Westerlands. Harrenhal remained a significant hub, with Davos and Brienne coordinating efforts to restore order across a realm still reeling from the collapse of old power structures. Word trickled in that down in Dorne, pockets of civilization endured largely untouched by the war, now sending ships of food to King's Landing's ruins for reconstruction. And as roads opened, more survivors from across the sea, Essos, the free cities ventured back, uncertain but hopeful. Within Winterfell, the old gloom had long since lifted, replaced by the clamor of commerce and daily life. Children splashed in the courtyard puddles after summer rains. Stonemasons from the Vale helped rebuild collapsed towers, adding new crenellations that soared toward the sky. The library tower, partially restored, housed new books donated or copied by traveling maesters. Scribes worked their day and night, recording the story of the long night as best they could, preserving the names of the lost. The crypts below the castle remained a place of solemn reverence, but they no longer inspired the same dread. People came to pay respects, to light lanterns by the tombs of heroes, including those who fell in the last stand against the dead. Sansa presided over the first official moot of the North in the newly stabilized Great Hall. Lords, ladies, knights, and free folk chieftains alike sat at rough-hewn benches, discussing laws to govern resource distribution, how to handle disputes, and the forging of alliances with the southern kingdoms also in the process of rebuilding. Some old tensions flared, but in the end, consensus emerged. The North would remain open to all who sought refuge in peace, and House Stark, represented by Sansa, would serve as steward and protector. Adeline stood at Sansa's side, contributing advice when needed. Not queen or lady, but recognized as a vital voice in Winterfell's leadership. When the moot ended, the delegates left with newfound respect for the open, collaborative spirit of the North. Travelers carried tales of how Winterfell stood like a phoenix rising from the ashes, guided by a unity that transcended old boundaries. They spoke of a young woman who carried an ancient sword and a Lady Stark who had seen the worst the world could offer but refused to be broken by it. They spoke of free folk who mingled with kneelers in daily tasks, forging an unshakable bond. They spoke of the ghost of winter that had finally departed, leaving the promise of spring in its wake. Even years later, some would say that victory had truly been forged not just in the final destruction of the Night King, but in the aftermath, when the living chose to build a better world rather than repeat the mistakes of the past. Winterfell became the symbol of that choice. And those who walked its halls carried the memory of the day the dead won this castle and how in the end that very defeat set the stage for the greatest renewal in Westerosi history. Of course, the shadows of the long night never vanished entirely. Some nights, Adeline would stand on the ramparts, looking out across the moonlit fields, half expecting to see the White Walker's eerie glow in the distance. The memories of the Whites, the scent of burning corpses, the echoing screams, these haunted her dreams. And she was not alone. Veterans of the war bore scars that ran deeper than flesh. Yet each time the chill of remembrance coursed through her, she would glance at the torchlit courtyard below, at the interplay of life and labor, and remind herself that the realm had faced its darkest hour and lived on. Sansa, too, carried her own ghosts. Some nights she would wake from nightmares, trembling, reliving her captivity and the countless betrayals she had endured. On those occasions, she might wander the castle, eventually stumbling upon Adeline or Mira, who would offer a quiet presence until the worst passed. In the morning, she would mask her fear with resolve, carrying on the burdens of leadership. Over time, those nightmares became less frequent, replaced by the daily demands of governance and the slow joy of healing. As the realm inched toward an era of relative peace, a new generation began to grow up in Winterfell's corridors. These children knew the stories of the White Walkers as cautionary tales, but they did not carry the same raw terror as their parents. They ran through the yard, playing at knights and dragons, forging friendships across old house lines. Adeline found a bittersweet solace in watching them. The thought that these young ones might never truly understand how close the world had come to annihilation was both comforting and poignant. Eventually, the day came when a group of travelers from Essos arrived, bringing seeds from faraway lands, exotic spices, and news of the outside world. They spoke of renewed trade across the narrow sea, the rise of new rulers, the attempts at forging stable governments in war-torn regions. Westeros, they said, was no longer seen as a cursed land of ice and death, but as a place that had confronted apocalypse and emerged with lessons to share. In the midst of these changes, Adeline sometimes thought back to that fearful girl who had fled Winterfell on the night of its fall. She barely recognized that version of herself now. She had learned to trust in her own strength and in the camaraderie of people from all walks of life. She had faced unspeakable horrors and come out with an unshakable conviction that the living, when united by empathy and common purpose, could triumph over even the darkest foe. One crisp morning, with the sun shining brilliantly over the rejuvenated castle, Adeline stood on the edge of the Godwood Pond, staring at her reflection in the still water. The Valyrian steel sword was strapped to her back, and around her shoulders she wore a simple cloak bearing the symbol of Winterfell, a dire wolf sewn from patches of cloth. She hardly noticed the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the small scars on her hands. What she noticed most was the look of calm in her gaze. After a moment, she inhaled deeply and turned to see Sansa and Mira standing nearby, both watching her quietly. The weirwood leaves rustled overhead, a quiet chorus of white on red. Sansa gave a slight nod, a gentle smile ghosting her lips. "We've come a long way." "We have," Adeline replied, stepping away from the pond. "And we still have so much to do." Mira's eyes gleamed with a wry warmth. "That's the way of life, isn't it? We survive, rebuild, and carry on. One day, the children of tomorrow might ask us what it was like to face the dead and win back the world." Adeline thought about that, the question echoing in the hush of the Godwood. How could they possibly put it into words? The terror of that endless night, the heartbreak of seeing friends and family fall, the overwhelming despair, the frantic final stand at Harrenhal, and the unimaginable relief when the Night King shattered. Then the slow, grueling process of starting over. Perhaps the truth was that no single explanation would suffice. Each of them held a piece of the story, bound together by the memory of the White Walkers' victory at Winterfell and the living's ultimate reclaiming of hope. She looked at her two friends, the Lady of Winterfell and the brave Crannogwoman, and in that moment she felt a sense of belonging as deep as the castle's ancient roots. The past had shaped them, but it did not own them. They were free to walk forward, forging a future worthy of the sacrifices that made it possible. So they did. Brick by brick, crop by crop, alliance by alliance, the North rose. And through it all, Winterfell stood as a testament that even if the dead could win a battle, the living could still find a way to ultimately claim the dawn.